In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, desperation drives a young mother to steal bread for her dying child. Josie Lang never imagined her life would come to this, standing before an angry crowd, clutching stolen goods while her fevered boy waits. At home, the townspeople see her as nothing more than a burden, a cautionary tale of moral failure. But Graham Sinclair sees something different. The wealthy, widowed rancher has built walls around his heart thicker than his ranch's stone foundations. Yet something about this desperate woman's quiet dignity pierces through decades of careful isolation. In a moment that surprises everyone, including himself, he steps forward to pay her debt. What starts as reluctant charity becomes something neither expected. As Josie and her child find refuge at his ranch, her gentle strength begins to crack the ice around Graham's wounded soul. But when the past comes calling and the town turns against them both, will love be enough to heal two broken hearts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Cedar Ridge in shades of amber and dust, casting long shadows across the main street where yesterday's drama had unfolded. The Wyoming Territory town sat like a weathered jewel in the valley, surrounded by rolling hills that stretched toward distant mountains. It was 1885, and the frontier still held its grip on places like this, where a man's word meant everything and a woman's reputation could be destroyed by whispers. Josie Lang pressed her face against the cracked window pane of her cramped room, above Murphy's saloon, watching the town wake up below. Her fingers traced the glass absently as she listened to Tommy's labored breathing from the narrow bed behind her. The boy had been running a fever for 3 days now, his small frame racked with coughs that seemed to echo from deep within his chest. The room was barely large enough for the bed, a washstand, and the wooden crate that served as their table. Josie's sewing basket sat in the corner, her livelihood, what little of it remained. She took in mending and alterations for the town's ladies, though fewer and fewer came to her now. Word travelled fast in Cedar Ridge, and a woman living above a saloon, even one who kept to herself and minded her own business, was suspect by nature. She turned from the window and knelt beside Tommy's bed, placing a cool cloth on his forehead. At 7 years old, he was small for his age, with his father's dark hair and her own green eyes. Those eyes looked up at her now with the trusting faith that only children possess, even when their world is crumbling around them. "Mama, I'm hungry," he whispered, his voice hoarse from coughing. Josie's heart clenched. She had exactly 12 cents to her name, and the rent was due tomorrow. Mrs. Murphy had been patient, more patient than most would be, but even her kindness had limits. The bread she'd stolen yesterday would have fed them for 2 days. Now, it sat in her mind like a guilty secret, even though it had been paid for by a stranger's unexpected grace. Graham Sinclair. She'd known of him, of course. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew of the Sinclair Ranch, spread across thousands of acres just outside town. They knew he was wealthy, reclusive, and had a temper that could freeze July. What they didn't expect was the quiet way he'd stepped forward yesterday, his voice calm and steady as he told Mrs. Patterson to put the bread on his account. Josie had wanted to refuse, to maintain what little dignity she had left. But Tommy's needs had silenced her pride. She'd taken the bread and hurried home, her cheeks burning with shame and something else she couldn't quite name. Now, as she smoothed Tommy's hair back from his fevered brow, she wondered what kind of man paid a stranger's debt without asking for anything in return. In her experience, men always wanted something. Across town, Graham Sinclair stood in his kitchen, staring at the wedding ring he still wore on his left hand. The gold band caught, the morning light streaming through windows that Sarah had once adorned with cheerful curtains. Those curtains were gone now, along with most traces of the woman who had briefly brought warmth to this house. The Sinclair ranch house was built to last, constructed of local stone and timber that could withstand the harsh Wyoming winters. It sprawled across a gentle rise, commanding a view of the valley and the distant mountains. Graham's grandfather had built it with dreams of filling it with generations of Sinclairs. Instead, it had become a monument to loneliness, its rooms echoing with memories of what might have been. Graham was 35 years old, though the lines around his grey eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair made him appear older. 3 years of grief had a way of aging a man beyond his years. He'd married Sarah when he was 28, sure that love and determination could conquer anything. She died giving birth to their son, and the baby had followed her within hours. Since then, Graham had spoken to no one unless business required it, attended no social gatherings, and built walls around his heart that seemed impenetrable. Yet, something about Josie Lang had reached through those walls yesterday. Perhaps it was the way she'd held her head high despite her circumstances, or the fierce protectiveness he'd seen in her eyes when she mentioned her child. Whatever it was, he'd found himself stepping forward before he could think better of it. He pulled on his coat and hat, preparing for another day of ranch work that would keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. As he stepped onto the front porch, he paused, looking toward town. Somewhere in those buildings, a woman was caring for a sick child with nothing but determination and love. It reminded him of something Sarah used to say about grace appearing in unexpected places. Back in town, Doc Henderson was making his morning rounds when he heard the familiar sound of Tommy's cough echoing from the room above Murphy's saloon. Henry Henderson had been Cedar Ridge's doctor for 20 years, and he'd learned to read the signs of desperation in his patients' faces. He'd delivered Tommy Lang 7 years ago, back when Josie was still the preacher's daughter and her husband, was alive to provide for his family. Life had a way of turning decent people inside out, he reflected as he climbed the narrow stairs. Robert Lang had been a good man, but consumption had taken him when Tommy was barely 4, leaving Josie with nothing but debts and a reputation that suffered from circumstances beyond her control. Her father, Reverend Marcus Lang, had been the town's moral compass until his own stubbornness and pride had driven a wedge between him and his daughter. The old man had died 2 years ago, taking his regrets with him to the grave. Doc Henderson knocked softly on Josie's door. "It's Doc Henderson, Josie. Thought I'd check on the boy." The door opened, revealing a woman who'd once been the prettiest girl in Cedar Ridge. Josie Lang was still beautiful, but it was a worn beauty now, polished by hardship and loss. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, and her green dress, though clean and carefully mended, had seen better days. "Doc, I can't pay for a visit right now," she said quietly, though she stepped aside to let him in. "Who said anything about payment?" he replied gruffly, setting his medical bag on the wooden crate. "Let me look at the boy." As Doc Henderson examined Tommy, Josie stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. The doctor's gentle manner with her son brought tears to her eyes. Kindness had become such a rare thing in her life that she hardly knew how to receive it anymore. "The boy needs better air and regular meals," Doc Henderson said finally, straightening up. "This room is too small, too damp. The fever's breaking, but he needs proper care to fully recover." Josie nodded, though they both knew she had no means to provide what Tommy needed. "I'll do what I can." The doctor studied her for a long moment. "You know, there's talk around town about yesterday, about Graham Sinclair paying for your bread." Josie's cheeks flushed. "It was charity, nothing more. I don't expect it to happen again." "Maybe not," Doc Henderson said thoughtfully, "but Graham Sinclair doesn't do anything without reason. In all the years I've known him, he's never involved himself in anyone else's troubles. Makes a person wonder what he saw in you that the rest of us have been blind to." After the doctor left, Josie sat beside Tommy's bed, her mind churning. She'd built her life around taking care of herself and her son, never depending on anyone else's kindness. It was safer that way. When you expected nothing from people, they couldn't disappoint you. But yesterday had cracked something open inside her, a longing for connection she'd buried beneath layers of self-protection. Tommy's breathing was easier now, and colour was returning to his pale cheeks. She smoothed his hair and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Her father had taught her that God's grace often came in unexpected packages, though she'd questioned that teaching many times over the past few years. Perhaps yesterday had been one of those moments. Grace appearing in the form of a stern-faced rancher with gentle hands and eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. As the day wore on, Josie found herself thinking about Graham Sinclair more than she cared to admit. What kind of man lived alone in that big house, surrounded by wealth, but apparently untouched by joy? She'd heard the stories about his wife's death, whispered with the mixture of pity and fascination that small towns specialized in. But yesterday, she'd seen something in his face that went beyond grief, a recognition, as if he understood what it meant to have life strip away everything you thought you could count on. The sun was setting when she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs outside. Her door. Her heart leaped, though she couldn't say whether from fear or anticipation. The knock, when it came, was firm but not demanding. She opened the door to find Graham Sinclair standing in the narrow hallway, his hat in his hands, and an expression on his face that seemed equal parts determined and uncertain. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, with the kind of presence that commanded attention, even when he wasn't speaking. "Mrs. Lang," he said, his voice carrying the slight roughness of a man unaccustomed to social conversation. "I've come to speak with you about your boy." Josie stepped back, gesturing for him to enter, though the small room felt even more cramped with his presence filling it. Graham's eyes took in their modest surroundings without judgment, settling on Tommy, who was awake and watching this unexpected visitor with curious eyes. "The boy needs better conditions to recover properly," Graham said without preamble. "Doc Henderson says the air here isn't good for him." "I'm doing the best I can," Josie replied, defensive despite herself. "I'm not criticizing," Graham said, quickly. "I'm offering an alternative." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and unspoken questions. Finally, Josie found her voice. "What kind of alternative?" Graham shifted his weight slightly, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He wasn't a man comfortable with speeches or grand gestures, but something about this woman and her child had stirred feelings he'd thought buried with Sarah. He looked down at Tommy, whose fever-bright eyes watched him with the unguarded curiosity of childhood. "My ranch has plenty of space," Graham said finally. "Clean air, good water, proper food. The boy could recover there, and you could—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like charity. "You could help with the household. I've been managing on my own since my wife died, but the place could use a woman's touch." Josie stared at him, her green eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been fear. "Mr. Sinclair, I don't understand. You don't know us. Why would you make such an offer?" Graham was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between mother and child. The truth was, he didn't fully understand it himself. Yesterday, watching her stand before that hostile crowd with nothing but dignity and determination, something had stirred in his chest, a recognition of courage he hadn't felt since Sarah's last days. "Maybe because I know what it's like to feel alone in the world," he said simply, "and maybe because that boy deserves a chance to grow up strong and healthy." Tommy coughed, a harsh sound that seemed to echo in the small room. Josie immediately went to him, smoothing his hair and murmuring soft words of comfort. Graham watched the tender scene and felt an old ache in his chest, the longing for family, for the sound of children's voices in his empty house. "I can't accept charity," Josie said finally, not looking up from her son. "I won't be beholden to anyone." "It's not charity," Graham replied, his voice firm. "It's work. You'd earn your keep, same as any hired help. The only difference is you'd bring your boy along." Josie met his eyes, searching for hidden motives or conditions that would make this offer too dangerous to accept. She'd learned to be wary of men who seemed too generous, too willing to help a woman in desperate circumstances. But Graham Sinclair's grey eyes held no calculation, no hint of anything beyond genuine concern. "What exactly would you expect of me?" she asked. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, basic household management. The ranch hands take care of the livestock and field work, but the house—" He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing years of neglect. "It's been empty too long." Tommy stirred in his bed, his small voice cutting through the tension. "Mama, is the man going to help us?" Josie's heart clenched at the hope in her child's voice. How long had it been since Tommy had expressed hope about anything? She looked at Graham, seeing past his stern exterior to something that reminded her of her father in his gentler moments. A fundamental decency that couldn't be feigned. "I need time to think," she said. Graham nodded, settling his hat back on. His head. "The offer stands. Doc Henderson knows where to find me when you've decided." After he left, Josie sat heavily on the edge of Tommy's bed, her mind reeling. The practical part of her knew this was the answer to their immediate problems: food, shelter, proper care for Tommy. But the part of her that had been hurt and disappointed too many times whispered warnings about trusting strangers, about depending on anyone other than herself. Tommy's small hand found hers. "I like him, Mama. He has kind eyes." Children saw things adults missed, Josie reflected. Tommy's instincts about people had always been good, even at his young age. When her father had raged about her choices and her reputation, Tommy had hidden behind her skirts, sensing the anger, if not understanding it. But with Graham Sinclair, he'd shown no fear, only curiosity. That night, as Tommy slept more peacefully than he had in days, Josie sat by the window looking out at the stars. She thought about her father's sermons about God providing for those who trusted, about doors opening when windows closed. She'd stopped believing in such simple faith after Robert died and her world fell apart. But perhaps she'd been looking for the wrong kind of miracles. The next morning brought Doc Henderson, carrying a small bag of medicine and wearing an expression of gentle determination. "How's our patient today?" he asked, immediately going to Tommy's bedside. "Better, I think. The fever broke during the night." Doc Henderson examined Tommy thoroughly, nodding with satisfaction. "He's improving, but slowly. This environment isn't helping his recovery." He turned to Josie with a meaningful look. "I understand you've had an interesting offer." Josie flushed. "News travels fast in this town, faster than a prairie fire." Doc Henderson agreed with a slight smile. "But before you let pride make your decision for you, consider what's best for the boy. And for yourself. You think I should accept? I think Graham Sinclair is a good man who's been carrying grief too long. I think you're a good woman who's been carrying burdens no one should bear alone. Maybe it's time both of you had some help." After the doctor left, Josie found herself pacing the small room, weighing options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. She could continue struggling here, watching Tommy's health decline while her own options dwindled, or she could take a leap of faith with a man who'd shown her more kindness in 2 days than she'd received in 2 years. By afternoon, she'd made her decision. Graham was repairing fence posts when he saw the small figure walking across his land. Josie Lang moved with purpose, carrying a carpet bag and holding Tommy's hand as they made their way toward the ranch house. He set down his tools and walked to meet them, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. "Mrs. Lang," he said when they were close enough to speak. "Mr. Sinclair." Josie lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I've come to accept your offer, with conditions." Graham nodded, respecting her need to maintain some control over the situation. "What conditions?" "I work for my keep. Nothing more. No special treatment. No pity. If Tommy and I don't suit, you tell us straight, and we'll leave with no hard feelings." "Agreed," Graham said simply. Tommy looked up at the tall rancher with wide eyes. "Are we going to live in your big house?" Graham knelt down to the boy's level, his stern face softening slightly. "For a while, yes. Think you'd like that?" Tommy nodded eagerly, and for the first time in days, his smile reached his eyes. As they walked toward the house, Josie felt a mixture of apprehension and relief. She was trading the familiar misery of independence for the unknown complications of depending on Graham Sinclair's generosity. But watching Tommy's excitement as he took in the vast ranch spread before them, she knew she'd made the right choice. The house was even more impressive up close. Solid stone walls, wide windows, and a front porch that wrapped around two sides. It spoke of prosperity and permanence, things that had been absent from Josie's life for so long she'd almost forgotten what they looked like. Inside, the house told a different story. The furniture was well made but dusty, the windows unwashed, and an air of neglect hung over rooms that had once been carefully tended. This was a house where a woman had lived and loved, and where her absence was felt in every corner. "Your room is upstairs," Graham said, leading them up a wide staircase. "The boy can have the room next to yours." The room he showed her was larger than her entire space above Murphy's saloon, with a real bed, a wardrobe, and windows that looked out over the valley. Tommy's room was smaller but bright, with a view of the barn and corrals where horses moved like shadows in the afternoon light. "It's beautiful," Josie said softly, and meant it. Graham seemed pleased by her approval, though he tried to hide it behind his usual stern expression. "I'll leave you to settle in. Supper's usually around 6, though I'm not much of a cook." That evening, Josie prepared their first meal in the Sinclair kitchen, grateful for the well-stocked pantry and the luxury of fresh ingredients. She found herself humming as she worked, something she hadn't done in years. Tommy sat at the large kitchen table, coloring on paper Graham had provided, his cough already less frequent in the cleaner air. When Graham came in from his evening chores, he stopped in the doorway, struck by the scene before him. The kitchen glowed with warm lamplight, filled with the sounds and smells of family life he'd thought lost forever. Josie moved efficiently between stove and counter, her hair escaping its pins in the kitchen's warmth, while Tommy chattered about the horses he'd seen from his window. For a moment, Graham allowed himself to imagine this wasn't temporary, that the emptiness that had haunted his house for 3 years might finally be filled. Then reality reasserted itself, reminding him that Josie Lang was here out of necessity, not choice, and that he had no right to expect more than the working arrangement they'd agreed upon. But as they sat down to their first dinner together, Graham found himself stealing glances at the woman across from him, wondering if perhaps grace really did come in unexpected packages, just as Sarah used to say. The first week at the Sinclair Ranch passed like a careful dance between strangers, learning each other's rhythms. Josie rose before dawn, determined to prove her worth through industry and efficiency. She attacked the neglected house with the fervor of someone who understood that security came through making herself indispensable. Tommy thrived in the clean mountain air, his cough diminishing daily as color returned to his pale cheeks. He followed Graham around the ranch with the devotion of a loyal puppy, asking endless questions about horses, cattle, and the mysterious workings of ranch life. Graham, unaccustomed to such constant chatter, found himself oddly charmed by the boy's enthusiasm. "Why do the horses sleep standing up?" Tommy asked one morning as they walked to the barn. "They don't always," Graham replied, his tone patient despite his usual preference for silence. "But they can rest that way, ready to run if there's danger." "Like Mama," Tommy said with the casual wisdom of childhood. "She never really sleeps, always listening for trouble." The observation struck Graham more deeply than the boy could know. He glanced toward the house, where he could see Josie hanging laundry on the line he'd strung for her between 2 cottonwood trees. Even from a distance, there was something watchful in her posture, as if she expected this peace to be temporary. That afternoon, while organizing the pantry, Josie discovered a trunk tucked behind bags of flour and sugar. It was made of polished cedar with brass fittings, and when she lifted the lid, she found herself looking into the preserved life of Sarah Sinclair. There were delicate china teacups wrapped in silk, embroidered linens that spoke of hours of careful needlework, and a silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a young woman with gentle eyes and a soft smile. Josie's hands trembled as she lifted one of the teacups, admiring its delicate rose pattern. She could imagine this woman serving tea to friends, planning menus for dinner parties, filling this house with laughter and warmth. The weight of stepping into Sarah's place, even temporarily, suddenly felt overwhelming. Those were Sarah's. Josie spun around, nearly dropping the cup. Graham stood in the doorway, his face unreadable as he looked at the open trunk. "I'm sorry," Josie said quickly, carefully replacing the cup. "I was just organizing, and I found this behind the supplies. I didn't mean to pry." Graham stepped into the pantry, his large frame filling the small space. He reached past Josie to lift the silver locket, opening it to reveal the portrait inside. "She painted this herself. Said she wanted me to have something to remember her by when I traveled to cattle markets." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Josie heard it nonetheless. She'd become an expert in recognizing the sound of carefully managed grief. "She was beautiful," Josie said softly. She was. Graham closed the locket with a gentle snap. "She died trying to give me a son. The baby lasted 4 hours. The stark words hung between them in the dusty air of the pantry. Josie understood now why this house felt so hollow, why Graham moved through it like a ghost, haunting his own life. "I had a baby too," she found herself saying, "before Tommy, a little girl. She was born too early, lived just long enough for me to name her, Grace. I called her Grace." Graham's grey eyes met hers, and in that moment they shared the particular sorrow of parents who had held children they couldn't save. It was a grief that never fully healed, only learned to carry more quietly. "I should put these away," Graham said finally, gesturing toward the trunk. "Or you could let them be part of the house again," Josie suggested gently. "Beautiful things shouldn't hide in darkness. She made them to be used, to bring joy." Graham stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You think I should use Sarah's things? I think she loved you and this house enough to want it filled with life again, not preserved like a shrine." That evening, they sat down to dinner at a table set with Sarah's china. The delicate cups looked strange in Graham's large hands, but he handled them with careful reverence. Tommy was delighted with the fancy dishes, promising to be extra careful. As he sipped his milk from a cup painted with tiny roses, "It's like we're fancy people," Tommy announced, making both adults smile. "We are fancy people," Josie said, ruffling his hair. "At least tonight we are." As the days passed, other changes began to emerge. Josie opened curtains that had been drawn for years, letting light flood into rooms that had grown accustomed to shadows. She placed wildflowers from the meadow in Sarah's crystal vases, their simple beauty bringing color to the formal dining room. The house began to breathe again, coming alive under her careful attention. Graham watched these transformations with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Part of him welcomed the return of warmth to his home, but another part felt guilty for allowing another woman to take Sarah's place, even in such practical ways. He found himself talking to Sarah's portrait in the bedroom, explaining about Josie and Tommy as if seeking permission for their presence. One evening, as Josie was teaching Tommy to read by lamplight in the front parlor, Graham lingered in the doorway watching them. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that it made his chest ache with longing. This was what he'd dreamed of during those long months of Sarah's pregnancy. Quiet evenings with his family, the sound of a child's laughter echoing through rooms built for love. "Would you like to join us?" Josie asked, noticing his presence. Graham hesitated, then settled into the chair across from them. "What are you reading?" "Bible stories," Tommy said proudly, pointing to the worn book in his mother's lap. "This one's about a man who built a big boat." "Noah's Ark," Graham said, remembering similar evenings from his own childhood when his mother had read to him from the same stories. "Mama says God saved Noah because he was faithful," Tommy continued. "Even when other people laughed at him for building a boat where there wasn't any water." Josie's eyes met Graham's over Tommy's head, and he saw a question there, Was this faith talk welcome in his house? Graham had stopped believing in divine intervention when Sarah died, but watching Tommy's earnest face, he found he didn't want to dim the boy's natural hope. Sometimes being faithful means doing what's right, even when it's hard, Graham said carefully. Tommy nodded solemnly, as if this wisdom made perfect sense to his 7-year-old mind. Like when Mama took me away from Grandpa's house, even though she was scared. Josie's face tightened slightly, and Graham realized there were stories about her past that hadn't been shared yet. The boy's innocent comment hinted at complexities in Josie's history that went beyond simple poverty and widowhood. Later, after Tommy had been tucked into bed, Josie and Graham found themselves alone in the kitchen, sharing coffee and the comfortable quiet that had begun to develop between them. "Tommy mentioned your father," Graham said carefully. "I remember Reverend Lang. He was a good man, though perhaps a bit rigid in his views." Josie's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "He was a good man until I disappointed him beyond forgiveness. When Robert got sick and couldn't work, my father wanted us to come live with him, but Robert was proud, said he'd provide for his own family. We struggled for months before Robert died, too proud to ask for help." She paused, staring into her coffee as if reading memories in its dark surface. "After the funeral, my father said I could come home if I admitted my mistakes and lived by his rules. But his rules meant giving up any independence, any right to make my own choices. I chose poverty over submission, and he chose righteousness over love." Graham listened without judgment, understanding now why Josie guarded her independence so fiercely. She'd been forced to choose between security and self-respect before, and she'd chosen the harder path. "He died, believing I was lost," Josie continued, quietly. "Doc Henderson said he asked about Tommy and me near the end, but his pride was stronger than his love. Just like mine, I suppose. Pride's not always a sin," Graham said. "Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps a person standing." Their eyes met across the table, and Josie felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared stubbornness and shared pain. They were both people who'd chosen difficult paths rather than easy compromises, and perhaps that understanding was the beginning of something deeper than mere convenience. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its voice carrying across the valley like a lonely prayer. Inside the warm kitchen, two wounded souls sat in comfortable silence, slowly learning that perhaps they didn't have to carry their burdens alone. The second week brought a rhythm to their lives that felt both natural and fragile. Josie woke each morning with a sense of purpose she'd almost forgotten, while Graham found himself lingering over breakfast, reluctant to begin the day's work. That would take him away from the warmth of the kitchen, where Josie hummed softly as she prepared meals. Tommy's transformation was the most remarkable. The pale, listless child who'd arrived at the ranch was becoming a sturdy boy with sun-kissed cheeks and an insatiable curiosity about everything around him. He shadowed Graham during the morning chores, learning to gather eggs from the henhouse and fill water troughs for the horses. "Can I ride one of the horses?" Tommy asked one morning as they watched the animals graze in the pasture. Graham considered the request seriously. "You'll need to learn to care for them first. Riding comes after you understand responsibility." It was a lesson the boy took to heart, approaching each task with the solemnity of someone much older. Josie watched from the kitchen window as Graham patiently showed Tommy how to brush the gentlest mare, his large hands guiding small ones in long, careful strokes along the horse's neck. That evening, as had become their custom, they gathered in the parlor for Tommy's reading lesson. Josie had discovered a leather-bound volume of poetry among the books in Graham's study, and tonight she read from it instead of the Bible. The verses spoke of love and loss, hope and redemption, themes that seemed to echo their own circumstances. "Do you believe in second chances?" Josie asked Graham as Tommy dozed against her shoulder. Graham was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire crackling in the hearth. "I used to think life gave you one chance at happiness, and if you lost it, that was the end. Sarah was supposed to be my whole future, And now I'm not sure what I believe. He met her eyes across the lamplit room. What about you? After everything you've been through, do you still have faith? Josie's fingers traced the worn spine of her father's Bible, which she still read each night before sleep. My father taught me that faith without doubt isn't really faith at all. It's just assumption. I've had plenty of doubt these past few years, but somehow the faith remains. Changed, maybe. Scarred, but still there, even after he turned his back on you. Especially then. If I only believed when life was easy, what kind of faith would that be? She looked down at Tommy's sleeping face. This child has kept my faith alive more than any sermon ever did. Every morning he wakes up believing the day will bring something good, even when yesterday was hard. That's the kind of faith I want to have. Graham found himself drawn to this gentle theology, so different from the harsh judgment he'd grown up with. His own father had been a stern man who saw God as a demanding taskmaster rather than a loving parent. Perhaps that was why he'd found it so easy to turn away from faith when tragedy struck. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Cole rode up to the house just as Graham was heading out to check the cattle in the far pasture. Jim. Cole was a fair man, but his presence usually meant trouble of some kind. Graham, the sheriff said, dismounting and tying his horse to the porch rail. Need to have a word with you about Mrs. Lang. Graham's jaw tightened. What about her? Had some men come through town yesterday asking questions. Said they were looking for a woman named Josie Lang, claimed she owed them money. They seemed persistent. From the kitchen window, Josie watched the conversation with growing dread. She couldn't hear the words, but the tension in both men's postures was clear. When Graham's shoulders straightened and his hands clenched into fists, she knew her past had found her. What kind of men? Graham asked. The kind you don't want to owe money to, Sheriff Cole replied grimly. They said her late husband had gambling debts that passed to his widow. Legal, technically, though morally questionable. Graham's mind raced. He'd assumed Josie's financial troubles were simply the result of widowhood and her father's rejection. The possibility of debt collectors added a dangerous element he hadn't considered. How much time do we have? They're staying at the hotel. Plan to start searching the area today. Figured you'd want to know, given that she's working for you now. After the sheriff left, Graham found Josie in the kitchen, her face pale but composed. Tommy was playing with wooden blocks in the corner, oblivious to the tension filling the room. You heard? Graham said. Enough. Josie's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she folded the dish towel she'd been holding. I should pack. We can be gone within the hour. You're not going anywhere. The firmness in his voice surprised them both. Graham hadn't planned to say it, but the words came from somewhere deep inside him, a protective instinct he'd thought died with Sarah. Graham, you don't understand. These men, Robert owed them almost $200. They've been looking for me since he died. If they find me here, they'll make trouble for you too. Let them try. Graham's voice was quiet but steel-hard. This is my land, and you're under my protection. Josie stared at him, torn between gratitude and fear. Why would you risk that for us? We're nothing to you but temporary help. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to voice. Graham looked at Tommy, happily building towers with his blocks, then back, at Josie's frightened but determined face. Maybe you started as temporary help, he said slowly, but things change. That afternoon, while Tommy napped and Josie worked on mending in the parlor, Graham rode into town. He found the debt collectors at Murphy's saloon, two hard-faced men in city clothes who stood out like wolves among sheep in the frontier town. I understand you're looking for Josie Lang, Graham said, approaching their table with deliberate calm. The larger man, who introduced himself as Garrett, sized Graham up with calculating eyes. You know where she is? I know she works for me. I also know you're wasting your time. Dead husband's debts are legal debts, the second man, Kane, said with a cold smile. Woman inherits the obligations along with any assets. What assets? Graham laughed harshly. The woman barely had clothes on her back when I hired her. You want to collect blood from a stone, that's your business, but you won't be doing it. On my land. Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying Graham with new interest. Mighty protective of hired help, aren't you, Mr. Sinclair? I'm protective of what's mine, Graham replied evenly, and anyone working my land is under my protection. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. In a territory where a man's reputation it could mean the difference between respect and trouble. Graham Sinclair's word carried considerable weight. The debt collectors exchanged glances, recalculating their options. We could make this easy for everyone, Kane said finally. Pay the debt and we disappear. $200 and your hired help's troubles are over? Graham considered the offer. $200 was a significant sum, but not beyond his means. The question was whether paying would solve the problem or simply encourage more demands. Later, I'll think about it, he said, rising from the table. But while you're in my town, you keep away from my ranch. Are we clear? The men nodded, but their expression suggested this conversation was far from over. That evening, Graham told Josie about his encounter with Garrett and Kane. She listened with growing distress, wrapping her arms around herself as if warding off a chill. You shouldn't have confronted them, she said when he finished. They're dangerous men, Graham. They won't hesitate to hurt you to get to me. Then we'll have to make sure they don't get the chance. How? You can't watch over us. Every moment, and they're patient. They'll wait for an opportunity. Graham was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful but determined. There might be another way, but it would require you to trust me completely. What do you mean? Marriage. The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything they thought they understood about their arrangement. Josie's eyes widened, and for a moment she couldn't speak. A legal marriage would make you my wife, not Robert's widow. Graham continued, his tone carefully businesslike. Their claim on you would be void, and as my wife, you'd have the full protection of my name and resources. Graham, I can't ask you to... You're not asking, I'm offering. He met her eyes directly. It would be a marriage of convenience, nothing more. Separate rooms, no expectations. Just legal protection for you and Tommy. Josie's mind reeled. The practical part of her recognized the wisdom of his proposal. Marriage would indeed solve her legal problems and provide security for Tommy. But the woman in her, the part that had once believed in romantic love, felt a stab of something that might have been disappointment. You do that for us? For risk your reputation on a marriage to a woman the town already whispers about? Let them whisper, Graham said firmly. You've done nothing to be ashamed of. You've survived when others would have given up, and you've raised a fine boy under impossible circumstances. Any man would be proud to call you his wife. The sincerity in his voice made Josie's throat tighten with emotion. When was the last time someone had defended her character instead of questioning it? What about love? She asked quietly. Don't you want more than a business arrangement? Graham's expression grew distant, as if he were looking at something far away. I had love once. It nearly destroyed me when I lost it. I'm not sure I'm brave enough to risk that kind of pain again. They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, while each contemplated a future they'd never imagined. Finally, Josie spoke. If we did this, if we married, what would happen when you decided you wanted a real wife? A woman you could love? Then we'd deal with that when it happened, Graham said simply. But right now you need protection, and I can provide it. Sometimes the practical choice is the right choice. That night, as Josie lay in her bed listening to Tommy's peaceful breathing from the next room, she stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine herself as Mrs. Graham Sinclair. It would solve their immediate problems, but it would also bind her to a man who'd already admitted he wasn't looking for love. Was security worth the price of abandoning hope for something more? Outside her window, she could hear Graham pacing on the front porch, his footsteps regular as a heartbeat. Perhaps he was asking himself the same questions, wondering if a marriage, born of necessity, could ever become something real. In the darkness, two lonely people contemplated a future built on mutual need rather than mutual affection, each wondering if it would be enough. Spring arrived at the Sinclair ranch with the subtle persistence of hope itself, painting the valley in shades of green that seemed to whisper of new beginnings. Josie had given Graham her answer 3 days after his proposal, a quiet yes, spoken over morning coffee while Tommy played with the barn cats outside. They would marry within the week, a simple ceremony with Doc Henderson serving as witness and Sheriff Cole providing legal validation. The practical arrangements felt strangely intimate despite their businesslike nature. Graham opened accounts for Josie at the bank and the mercantile, explaining to curious townspeople that his new wife would be managing household purchases. The word wife felt foreign on his tongue, weighted with implications he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Josie found herself studying Graham with new eyes, noting details she'd overlooked when he was simply her employer. The way he unconsciously rubbed his left shoulder when the weather changed, suggesting an old injury. The careful manner in which he handled fragile things, as if afraid his large hands might cause damage. The fleeting expressions that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching, moments of longing that spoke of dreams he'd buried with his first wife. Tommy, blissfully unaware of the adult complexities swirling around him, threw himself into ranch life with the enthusiasm of a boy who'd never had space to run. Graham had begun teaching him to ride on a gentle mare named Buttercup, and the sight of them together, the tall, stern man and the eager child, stirred something in Josie's chest that she was careful not to name. "Can I call him Papa after you get married?" Tommy asked one evening as Josie tucked him into bed. The question caught her off guard. "What do you think about that? Would you like to? He's nice to me. And he knows about horses and fixing things. That's what papas do, isn't it?" Josie smoothed his hair, marveling at a child's ability to accept change that adults found so complicated. "Papas do many things, but the most important thing they do is love their children. Do you think Graham loves you?" Tommy considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "I think he's learning how, like I'm learning, to ride Buttercup. Sometimes you have to practice at new things." From the hallway, Graham heard the conversation and felt his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. He'd been avoiding thoughts of fatherhood since Sarah's death, but Tommy's innocent acceptance was slowly breaking down walls he'd thought were permanent. The boy's trust was both a gift and a responsibility he wasn't sure he deserved. The wedding preparations revealed how isolated both Graham and Josie had become. There were no friends to invite, no family to celebrate with, just the practical necessity of legal protection dressed up with Doc Henderson's wife's best tablecloth and wildflowers from the meadow. Mrs. Henderson had insisted on providing a cake, her gentle nature recognizing the loneliness behind their arrangement. "Every bride deserves something sweet on her wedding day," she'd said, ignoring Josie's protests that it wasn't necessary. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, conducted in the front parlor of the ranch house with only the necessary witnesses present. Josie wore her best dress, a blue cotton that brought out her eyes, while Graham had borrowed a suit from Doc Henderson that was slightly too short in the sleeves. Tommy stood between them during the vows, his small hand clasping both of theirs as if he understood his role in binding this unlikely family together. When Graham slipped the simple gold band onto Josie's finger, she was surprised by the warmth of his hands and the gentleness of his touch. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw something there that went beyond mere convenience. A recognition of partnership, perhaps even the possibility of companionship. "You may kiss the bride," Doc Henderson said with a slight smile. The moment stretched between them, awkward and charged with unspoken questions. Finally, Graham leaned down and brushed his lips against Josie's cheek, a chaste kiss that satisfied the legal requirement, while maintaining the emotional distance they'd agreed upon. As Mrs. Graham Sinclair, Josie discovered that her position in the community shifted subtly but significantly. The same women who'd whispered about her living situation now nodded politely when she accompanied Graham to town. The Sinclair name carried weight that her own had lost, and while the protection felt foreign, she was grateful for Tommy's sake. But the most significant changes were happening within the ranch house itself. Josie found herself suggesting improvements that went beyond basic housekeeping. New curtains for the dining room, a vegetable garden behind the kitchen, paint for the weathered front porch. Each suggestion was presented carefully, prefaced with "if you don't mind" or "when there's time." But Graham found himself agreeing to projects he'd never considered necessary. The house hasn't seen this much activity since, he began one evening, then stopped, realizing he'd been about to mention Sarah. "Since your wife died," Josie finished gently. "It's all right to talk about her, Graham." This was her home too. Graham studied his new wife's face, searching for jealousy or resentment, but finding only understanding. "Sometimes I feel guilty for letting you change things, as if I'm erasing her memory." "Memory isn't about keeping everything exactly the same," Josie said, thinking of her own complicated relationship with the past. "It's about honoring what was good while making room for what might be. Sarah loved this house, didn't she? She'd want it to be a home, not a museum." That weekend, they painted the front porch together. Graham on the high sections, Josie handling the detail work, and Tommy helping by painting his own small section with more enthusiasm than skill. The physical work was therapeutic, and Josie found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. This felt like building something, creating rather than just surviving. As they worked, neighbors began stopping by with various excuses, borrowing tools, delivering messages, checking on sick cattle. It took Josie several visits to realize they were actually curious about the new Mrs. Sinclair and the changes happening at the previously reclusive ranch. Graham seemed uncomfortable with the attention, but he tolerated it for her sake. "Folks are talking," he warned her one evening after the pastor's wife had spent an hour discussing plans for the church social. "Let them talk," Josie replied, surprising them both with her confidence. "We're not doing anything wrong. Some might say a marriage of convenience is wrong, that we're making a mockery of sacred vows." Josie set down her mending and looked at him directly. "Are we? We promised to care for each other, to be faithful, to build a life together. We're doing all of those things, just not in the traditional way. Maybe our marriage isn't built on passion, but it's built on something solid, mutual respect, shared responsibility, genuine caring. That's more than some love matches can claim." Graham considered her words, struck by their wisdom. In the weeks since their marriage, he'd found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, appreciating Josie's practical intelligence and gentle humor. She challenged his assumptions without confronting his pride, and she'd brought laughter back into his house through her patient relationship with Tommy. But it was a conversation with Tommy that finally forced Graham to confront his own changing feelings. The boy had been unusually quiet during their evening ride, and when Graham asked what was troubling him, Tommy's answer caught him completely off guard. "Are you going to send us away when you don't need us anymore?" Graham pulled up his horse, staring at the child in shock. "What made you think that?" "Billy Peterson said his mama told him that you only married mama to be nice, and that nice don't last forever. He said you'd probably get tired of us and find a real wife." The innocent repetition of adult gossip hit Graham like a physical blow. He dismounted and lifted Tommy from his pony, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Tommy, listen to me carefully. You and your mama aren't going anywhere. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be. And your mama isn't just any wife. She's my wife, the only wife I want or need. Promise?" "I promise." Graham said the words and realized he meant them more than he'd expected to. Somewhere in the past month, Josie and Tommy had stopped being temporary residents and had become family. That night, after Tommy was asleep, Graham found Josie on the front porch, enjoying the cool evening air and the symphony of crickets that filled the valley. She'd changed from her work dress into a simple wrapper, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders, an informal intimacy that spoke of growing comfort between them. "Tommy told me about his conversation with the Peterson boy," Graham said, settling into the chair beside her. Josie's shoulders tensed. "Children repeat what they hear at home. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." "I'm not sorry. It made me realize something I should have said weeks ago." Graham turned to face her fully. "This marriage may have started as a practical arrangement, but it's become something more. At least for me." Josie's heart began beating faster, but she kept her voice carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't want you to think of yourself as temporary anymore. This is your home, Josie. You belong here not because I need protection for you, but because I—" He struggled for words that wouldn't overstep the boundaries they'd established. "Because I can't imagine this place without you and Tommy anymore." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the shift in their relationship. Finally, Josie spoke. "I've felt it too, this sense of belonging. But I didn't want to assume—" "You don't have to assume anything. I'm telling you directly, whatever this is between us, it's real. It's worth protecting and nurturing." As if to underscore his words, a shooting star streaked across the sky above them, its brief brilliance illuminating the valley before fading into darkness. Josie made a silent wish. Not for love, exactly, but for the courage to let whatever was growing between them continue to unfold naturally. Inside the house, Tommy slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that he had a home and a family. And, on the front porch, two people who'd learned not to expect too much from life sat side by side, cautiously hopeful that sometimes the most lasting happiness came not from grand passion, but from quiet partnership and gradual understanding. Summer settled over the Sinclair ranch like a warm blanket, bringing long days of productive work and evenings filled with the comfortable rhythms of family life. The debt collectors had departed Cedar Ridge after Sheriff Cole made it clear their continued presence wasn't welcome, but their brief appearance had accomplished something unexpected. It had forced Graham and Josie to acknowledge that their arrangement had evolved beyond mere convenience. The changes were subtle but profound. Graham found himself lingering over breakfast, reluctant to begin the day's work that would separate him from Josie's quiet presence. She had a way of moving through the morning routine that brought peace to the previously hurried meal, asking about his plans for the day, sharing small observations about Tommy's progress, or discussing improvements to the ranch with an intelligence that surprised and delighted him. Josie, for her part, discovered that marriage to Graham offered something she'd never experienced: true partnership. Robert had been a kind husband, but his gambling and eventual illness had made her more caretaker than companion. Graham sought her opinion on ranch decisions, listened to her suggestions about crop rotation and livestock management, and treated her insights with the respect she'd never known she craved. Tommy thrived in this atmosphere of mutual respect and growing affection. The boy had shot up several inches since spring, his frame filling out with good food and constant activity. Graham had begun teaching him more advanced ranch skills: how to repair fence posts, recognize signs of illness in cattle, and read the weather patterns that could mean the difference between a successful harvest and disaster. One evening, as they worked together to repair a broken gate, Tommy looked up at Graham with the serious expression he wore when wrestling with important thoughts. "Papa Graham," he said, testing the name they'd gradually settled on, "why did God take my first papa away, but give me you?" Graham's hands stilled on the fence wire. These were the moments that reminded him of the profound responsibility he'd accepted when he welcomed this child into his life. Tommy's questions deserved honest answers, not platitudes. "I don't know if God took your father away, son," Graham said carefully. "Sometimes people get sick and doctors can't make them well. But maybe God knew your mama needed help taking care of you, and he knew I needed a family to take care of. Maybe he brought us together because we all needed each other." Tommy considered this explanation with the gravity of a philosopher. So you needed us too, not just us needing. You? More than I realized, Graham admitted, surprised by his own honesty. This house was too quiet before you and your mama came. Now it feels like a real home. That night, Josie overheard Graham reading Tommy a bedtime story, something he'd begun, doing without being asked, his deep voice gentle as he brought fairy tale characters to life. She paused in the hallway, listening to her son's delighted laughter and Graham's patient responses to endless questions about princes and dragons and magical kingdoms. When Graham emerged from Tommy's room, he found Josie waiting in the hallway, her expression soft with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what? For loving him, for being the father he needed without even realizing it." Graham felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the woman standing before him in the lamplit hallway. Josie's hair was coming loose from its pins, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek from the bread she'd been kneading for tomorrow's breakfast. She looked tired and content and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with artifice. "He's easy to love," Graham said, his voice rougher than intended. "You both are." The words hung between them, more revealing than either had intended. For a moment, they stood close enough to touch, the air thick with possibilities neither was quite ready to explore. Then Josie stepped back, the spell broken but not forgotten. "I should finish cleaning the kitchen," she said softly. "Josie." Graham's voice stopped her as she turned toward the stairs. "What we talked about on the porch last week, about this being real, I meant it." She met his eyes in the dim hallway light. "I know. I meant it too." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor that would test the strength of their growing bond. Josie was hanging laundry when she saw a familiar figure walking up the path to the house, tall, silver-haired, and carrying himself with the dignity that had once commanded respect throughout Cedar Ridge. Marcus Lang Jr., her younger brother, had inherited their father's bearing, but not his rigidity. He'd been traveling when their father died, and Josie hadn't seen him in 3 years. Now he stood before her, his expression cautious but hopeful. "Hello, Josie," her hands stilled on the clothesline. "Marcus, what are you doing here? I heard about your marriage. Thought it was time we talked." From the kitchen window, Graham watched the reunion with growing tension. He'd heard about Marcus Lang, a successful lawyer who'd built a practice in Denver far from the shadow of his preacher father's reputation. The man's presence here could only mean complications for the fragile family structure they'd been building. Josie led her brother into the parlor, her movements stiff with the wariness of someone expecting disappointment. Graham remained in the kitchen, giving them privacy while staying close enough to intervene if needed. "You look well," Marcus observed, taking in the comfortable room and Josie's improved appearance. "Marriage to Sinclair agrees with you. It's been beneficial for all of us," Josie replied carefully. "Tommy has thrived here. Where is my nephew? I'd like to see him. He's with Graham, learning to work with the cattle. They'll be back for lunch." Marcus nodded, then leaned forward in his chair, his expression growing serious. "Josie, I owe you an apology. When Father disowned you, I should have spoken up. I should have helped. You were building your own life. I didn't expect you to choose." He sighed. "But I should have. You were grieving, Robert, struggling to care for a sick child, and our father chose righteousness over compassion. I'll always regret not standing up to him." Josie felt tears prick her eyes. She'd given up hope of reconciliation with any member of her family years ago. "Why now, Marcus? Why come here after all this time?" "Because I learned something that you should know about Father's will." Graham, despite his intention to give them privacy, found himself moving closer to the parlor door. Something in Marcus Lang's tone suggested this conversation was about to take a significant turn. "Father left you something, Josie, a substantial inheritance, almost $1,000 that he'd been setting aside for years, but he wrote the will in a way that required you to be respectably married, to claim it. Josie stared at her brother in shock. $1,000, but why didn't anyone tell me? Because the will specified that you couldn't know about the inheritance until after you married someone the executor deemed worthy. Father's way of controlling your choices, even from the grave, I suppose, but also his way of ensuring you'd be provided for. From the doorway, Graham felt a cold knot form in his stomach. $1,000 was a fortune, enough to give Josie complete independence, enough to make their marriage unnecessary from a practical standpoint. If she'd known about the inheritance, would she have married him at all? I don't understand, Josie said slowly. If this money was always there, why didn't you tell me about it when I was struggling? Because I only learned about it last month, when I was settling some of Father's final legal affairs. The inheritance was held in trust with a bank in Cheyenne, with very specific conditions for release. Marcus reached into his coat and withdrew a legal document. Your marriage to Graham Sinclair satisfies those conditions. The money is yours now if you want it. Josie took the papers with trembling hands, scanning the legal language that she didn't fully understand, but that clearly represented a freedom she'd never imagined possible. With this money, she could buy her own small house, perhaps even start a business. She could provide for Tommy's education, his future. She wouldn't need to depend on Graham's practical charity anymore. The realization struck her like a physical blow. If she'd known about this inheritance, she never would have accepted Graham's marriage proposal. She would have found another way to protect herself from the debt collectors. Their entire relationship had been built on her desperate need for security that it turned out she'd already possessed. When Graham and Tommy returned for lunch, they found Josie and Marcus in deep conversation over the legal documents. Tommy ran to his mother with his usual enthusiasm, chattering about the new calf he'd helped Graham deliver, but he quickly sensed the tension in the room. "Mama, is everything all right?" "Tommy, this is your Uncle Marcus, my brother." Tommy studied the stranger with the polite wariness Graham had taught him, offering a small hand for a formal shake. Marcus smiled, his face softening as he took in his nephew's healthy appearance and confident manner. "You've grown into a fine young man, Tommy. I'm glad to finally meet you properly." During lunch, Marcus observed the family dynamics with the trained eye of someone accustomed to reading people. He noted how Graham's attention constantly returned to Josie, how Tommy looked to both adults for approval and guidance, and how even their casual conversation suggested a partnership that went beyond mere convenience. But he also noticed the strain that had entered the atmosphere since his revelation about the inheritance. Josie seemed distant, preoccupied, while Graham had withdrawn into the stern reserve Marcus remembered from his younger days. After Tommy went outside to play, Marcus addressed the elephant in the room directly. "The inheritance changes things, doesn't it?" he said quietly. Graham's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting Josie answer for herself. "It changes everything," she admitted. "Graham married me to provide protection I desperately needed, but if I'd had this money, you would have found another way." Graham finished, his voice carefully neutral. "I understand. Do you?" Josie turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because I'm not sure I understand anything anymore. I feel like our entire marriage was built on a lie, my desperation for something I already had access to." Marcus watched this exchange with growing concern. He'd come here to right an old wrong, but he was beginning to realize he might have created a new one. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "the question isn't what brought you together, but what you've built since then. From what I've observed today, this seems like a genuine family, regardless of how it began." That evening, after Marcus had departed for his hotel in town, Graham and Josie found themselves alone on the front porch, the same place where they'd acknowledged their growing feelings just weeks earlier. Now the space between them felt charged, with uncertainty and unspoken questions. "What do you want to do?" Graham asked finally. Josie was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley that had become home. "I don't know. A month ago I would have said I wanted independence above everything else. But now I realize that what I thought was independence might actually have been loneliness, and what I thought was dependence might actually be partnership. Graham felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. The money doesn't have to change anything between us, Josie. It can just mean you're here by choice instead of necessity. But that's what scares me, she admitted. What if I made the wrong choice? What if I only think I care for you because you saved me when I was desperate? And what if you're overthinking this? Graham countered gently. What if the reason we found each other doesn't matter as much as what we do with what we've found? They sat in silence, each wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Inside the house, Tommy slept peacefully, trusting in the stability of the family they'd created. Outside, two adults who'd learned to be cautious with their hearts tried to navigate the complicated territory between practical partnership and something deeper, richer, and infinitely more frightening. The inheritance had given Josie the freedom to choose her own future. Now, she had to decide whether that future included the man who'd given her shelter when she needed it most, and who had somehow, without either of them quite realizing it, become essential to her happiness. The revelation came by accident, as the most life-changing discoveries often do. Josie was cleaning Graham's study the morning after Marcus's visit, dusting books that hadn't been touched in years, when a small photograph slipped from between the pages of a leather-bound volume of sermons. The sepia image fluttered to the floor, landing face up beside her feet. She bent to retrieve it, then froze. The photograph showed two young men, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, standing in front of a newly constructed church. One was unmistakably Graham, younger, less weathered, but with the same serious grey eyes. The other was her father, Marcus Lang Sr., but not the stern preacher she remembered from her childhood. This version of her father was laughing, his arm thrown around Graham's shoulders with the easy camaraderie of deep friendship. Written on the back in her father's careful script were the words, Graham and Marcus, Cedar Ridge Church Dedication, 1868. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. Proverbs 27:17. Josie sank into Graham's desk chair, the photograph trembling in her hands. The date meant Graham would have been barely 18 when this was taken, the same age she'd been when she married Robert. Her father would have been starting his ministry in Cedar Ridge, full of idealistic dreams about saving souls and building community. The door opened behind her, and Graham entered carrying a cup of coffee, stopping short when he saw her holding the photograph. "Where did you find that?" he asked quietly. "It fell out of one of your books." Josie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Graham, this is my father. You knew my father." Graham set down his coffee and moved to the window, his back to her as he stared out at the valley. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications and unspoken truths. "You knew who I was," Josie continued, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "That day at the mercantile when you stepped forward to pay for the bread, you knew exactly who I was." Yes. The single word fell between them like a stone, confirming what she'd already begun to suspect. Josie felt a complex mixture of emotions, betrayal, confusion, and something that might have been relief. "Why didn't you tell me?" Graham turned to face her, his expression revealing the weight he'd been carrying. "Because I was afraid you'd think I was helping you out of obligation to your father's memory, rather than because of who you are. And wasn't that exactly why you helped me?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with the pain of feeling manipulated. "At first, maybe," Graham admitted. "When I saw you standing there, holding your head high despite everything, I heard Marcus's voice in my head talking about grace and second chances. But by the time I brought you to the ranch, it wasn't about him anymore. It was about you and Tommy." Josie stood and moved away from him, needing distance to process this revelation. "Tell me about your friendship with my father. Tell me the truth this time." Graham ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of deep discomfort. Marcus Lang was my closest friend for almost 10 years. He was the one who convinced my family to help fund the church building. He taught me to read scripture, to think about what it meant to live with purpose and compassion. What happened between you? Life, Graham said simply. I fell in love with Sarah, and Marcus became concerned about my priorities. He thought I was putting earthly love before spiritual duty. When Sarah and I married, he preached a sermon about the dangers of making idols of human relationships. We argued, said things we couldn't take back. Josie remembered her father's rigid views on duty and sacrifice, his belief that human attachments could distract from divine calling. He drove you away just like he drove me away. We drove each other away, Graham corrected. I was young and angry, and I told him his version of faith was cold and judgmental. He said I was choosing the easy path over the righteous one. After that, we barely spoke, though we lived in the same town for 15 more years. Did you know about the inheritance? Graham met her eyes directly. I knew he'd set aside money. For you and Tommy. He told me about it 3 years ago, just before he died. He was full of regrets, Josie. He wanted to reach out to you, but his pride wouldn't let him admit he'd been wrong. The full scope of the deception hit her then. Not just Graham's silence about knowing her father, but the possibility that their entire relationship had been orchestrated by a dead man's guilty conscience. So when you saw me that day, you decided to play the role of my father's avenging angel, to ease his guilt and your own? No! Graham's voice was firm, almost angry. Marcus was already dead when I helped you. His opinion couldn't change anymore. I helped you because watching you stand up to that crowd reminded me of what courage looked like. Because your son was sick and you were desperate, and I knew what that felt like. But you must have felt obligated. Obligation doesn't explain the past 6 months, Josie. Obligation doesn't explain why I look forward to hearing your voice in the morning, or why Tommy's laughter makes this house feel alive again. Obligation doesn't explain why the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I'm drowning. The raw honesty in his voice stopped her protests. She looked at this man who'd become her husband, her partner, perhaps even something more, and tried to separate what was real from what might have been manipulation. How can I trust my own feelings when I don't know what's real anymore? She asked, the question emerging from her deepest fear. Maybe, said a voice from the doorway, you're asking the wrong questions. They turned to find Marcus Lang Jr. standing in the entrance to the study, his expression thoughtful as he took in the scene before him. His sister holding the old photograph, Graham's defensive posture, and the tension crackling between them. I apologize for intruding, Marcus continued, but Mrs. Patterson at the Mercantile told me you were discussing family matters. I thought I might be able to help clarify some things. What do you mean? Josie asked. Marcus entered the room fully, his gaze moving between the photograph in his sister's hands and Graham's guarded expression. I mean, I remember the friendship between father and Graham. I was 12 when they had their falling out. Old enough to understand that something important had been broken, he turned to Graham with a slight smile. Father talked about you, you know. Even after your argument, especially in his final years, he'd mentioned things you'd said, insights you'd shared about scripture or life. He never stopped considering you one of the finest men he'd ever known. Graham's jaw tightened. He had a strange way of showing it. He was a proud man who confused being right with being righteous, Marcus replied. But in his last months, when he was facing death, he talked about his regrets. You were one of them, Graham, along with how he'd treated Josie. Marcus moved to the window, looking out at the same view that had drawn Graham's attention earlier. He asked me to find you both after he died, to tell you that he was sorry, and that he hoped you'd find your way to forgiveness, of him and of yourselves. Then why didn't you? Josie asked. Because I was a coward, Marcus admitted. I was afraid you'd reject his apology the same way he'd rejected your pleas for understanding. I was afraid of opening old wounds that seemed to be healing on their own. He turned back to face them. But yesterday, watching the three of you together, you, Graham, and Tommy, I realized that maybe Father's final wish had already been granted. Maybe forgiveness doesn't always require an apology. Maybe sometimes it just requires people finding their way back to love. Josie sank back into the desk chair, overwhelmed by the layers of revelation and connection she was only beginning to understand. So you're saying Father wanted us to find each other? I'm saying Father recognized that two of the people he'd hurt through his stubbornness might be able to heal each other, Marcus clarified. Whether that happened through conscious design or divine providence is something you'll have to decide for yourselves. Graham moved closer to Josie, his expression softening as he saw the confusion and pain in her eyes. Does it matter what Marcus intended or didn't intend? Does it matter what brought us together if what we've built is real? But how do I know it's real? Josie's voice broke slightly. How do I know I'm not just fulfilling some plan my father made from beyond the grave? Because, Graham said gently, kneeling beside her chair, your father never knew Tommy. He never saw you teach that boy to read or watched you bring life back to this house. He never saw you face down gossips with dignity or tend a sick calf through the night because you couldn't bear to see anything suffer. Everything you've done here, everything you've become, that's all you, Josie, not your father's plan. Marcus watched this exchange with growing understanding. There's something else you should know, he said quietly. The inheritance Father left. It wasn't just money. There was a letter, too. Instructions that you were only to receive it if you chose to marry someone Father described as a man of character who would value your worth. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope. I was supposed to judge whether your husband met those criteria before releasing the funds. But after meeting Graham yesterday and seeing how he looks at you, how he treats Tommy, I think Father would have approved. Josie took the letter with shaking hands. Her name was written on the envelope in her father's familiar script, but underneath it were words that made her breath catch. For my daughter, who was always braver than I was wise enough to see. Inside, the letter was brief, but devastating. In its simplicity, my dear Josie, if you are reading this, then you have found love again, and I pray it is the kind of love that honors both heart and spirit. I was wrong to turn away from you when you needed guidance most. I was wrong to let pride keep me from helping when Robert was ill. I was wrong to value reputation over relationship, judgment over mercy. I cannot undo the years we lost, but I can ensure that you and Tommy have the security to build whatever future brings you joy. The money is yours without condition. Use it for education, for travel, for whatever dreams you've had to set aside. But more than financial security, I pray you found the peace that comes from being truly known and valued. Graham Sinclair was one of the finest young men I ever knew, and if God has seen fit to bring you together, then perhaps even an old fool's mistakes can be turned to good purpose. Live boldly, my daughter. Love deeply, and forgive your father, who loved you even when he failed to show it. With all my regrets and all my hope, Marcus Lang Sr. By the time Josie finished reading, tears were streaming down her face. Graham remained beside her chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, while Marcus watched from across the room with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally delivered a message too long delayed. He knew, Josie whispered. Somehow he knew we'd find each other. Or he hoped you would, Graham corrected. But hoping isn't the same as orchestrating. We still chose each other, Josie. Every day in 100 small ways, we've been choosing each other. That's what makes it real. Josie looked up at him through her tears, seeing past her own fears to the truth she'd been avoiding. The inheritance hadn't brought them together. Desperation and grace had done that. Her father's letter hadn't created. Their growing love, their daily choices, their shared struggles, their mutual respect had accomplished that. I've been so afraid, she admitted, afraid that caring for you was just gratitude, or that you were helping me just from obligation. But you're right. Obligation doesn't explain the way you read to Tommy every night, or how you've never once made me feel like a burden. And gratitude doesn't explain why I get excited when I hear your horse coming home, or why I've started thinking about next year's garden instead of next week's survival. Graham's hand tightened on her shoulder. So what do we do now? Josie stood, the letter still clutched in her hand, and faced both men. Her brother, who'd carried their father's regrets for too long, and her husband, who'd been carrying his own burden of secret knowledge. Now we stop letting the past define what we're building, she said with growing conviction. My father's money will secure Tommy's future, but it doesn't change what I want. And what I want is this family, this partnership, this life we've created together. She turned to Graham, her green eyes clear and determined. I choose you, Graham Sinclair, not because my father hoped I would, not because I need protection, but because in 6 months you've shown me what it means to be truly partnered with someone. You've given me back my courage, my hope, and my faith in the possibility of happiness. Graham stood and took her hands, his own voice rough with emotion. And I choose you, Josie, not because of your father's memory, but because you've brought my house back to life. Because you've shown Tommy what it means to be loved unconditionally, and you've shown me that second chances are real. From the doorway, Marcus Lang Jr. smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally made peace with his father's legacy. Outside, Tommy's laughter echoed across the yard as he played with the barn cats, blissfully unaware that the adults in his life had just chosen to stop questioning their happiness and start embracing it. The photograph that had started this revelation still lay on the desk, 2 young men full of hope and conviction, their friendship frozen in a moment before pride and principle drove them apart. But their story wasn't finished yet. In the love growing between their children, in the family being forged from loss and loneliness, perhaps even their broken friendship could find a kind of redemption. The days following the revelation about her father's letter passed in a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. Josie felt as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders, but in its place came a new kind of pressure, the responsibility of choosing her future from a position of strength rather than desperation. Marcus had returned to Denver, but not before ensuring the inheritance was properly transferred and legal arrangements were made. As Josie held the bank documents that represented her newfound independence, she found herself thinking less about what the money could buy and more about what it represented. The freedom to stay with Graham because she wanted to, not because she had to. But freedom, she was discovering, could be its own burden. Graham sensed her internal struggle without fully understanding it. In the week since Marcus's visit, he'd caught her staring out windows with a distant expression, or pausing mid-conversation, as if wrestling with unspoken thoughts. The easy companionship they'd developed seemed strained by the weight of choices that needed to be made. Tommy, with the sensitivity children often possess, seemed to absorb the tension between the adults. His usual chatter at meals gave way to careful observation, and he began asking questions that revealed his own fears about the stability of their family. "Are you going to go away now that you have money?" he asked Josie one evening as she tucked him into bed. The directness of the question caught her off guard. "What makes you think I might go away?" Billy Peterson's mama said rich ladies don't stay with cowboys. She said you might buy a fancy house in town and find a fancy husband. Josie felt a surge of anger at the town gossips who couldn't resist speculating about her business, but she kept her voice calm for Tommy's sake. "What do you think about that?" Tommy considered the question with his usual seriousness. "I think Billy Peterson's mama doesn't know you very good. You're not fancy. Like that, you're the kind of mama who stays." The simple faith in his voice made Josie's throat tighten with emotion. "You're right. I am the kind of mama who stays, and this is where I want to stay. With Papa Graham, too. Especially with Papa Graham." But even as she reassured Tommy, Josie knew the situation was more complicated than a child could understand. The money had changed the dynamic between her and Graham in subtle but significant ways. He was more formal with her now, more careful about expressing opinions or making requests. It was as if her newfound independence had made him uncertain about his place in her life. The crisis came, as such things often do, from an unexpected direction. Dr. Henderson arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning, his expression grave as he dismounted from his horse. Josie met him at the door, immediately concerned by his serious demeanor. "Is someone ill, Doc?" "Not ill, exactly, but I need to speak with you and Graham about a situation in town." They gathered in the kitchen, where Graham poured coffee with the automatic courtesy that masked his growing unease. Doc Henderson rarely made social calls, and his formal manner suggested this visit involved more than medical consultation. "There's been some talk," the doctor began carefully, "about your inheritance, about the circumstances of your marriage. Most folks have been supportive, but there are some who are less understanding." "What kind of talk?" Graham asked, his voice carrying a warning edge, the kind that questions whether a marriage of convenience is valid in the eyes of God and the law, the kind that suggests perhaps the arrangement should be reconsidered now that circumstances have changed. Josie felt a chill run through her. "Who's saying these things?" "Reverend Morrison, primarily. He's been making inquiries about the legal requirements for annulment. He seems to think you were coerced into marriage by desperate circumstances and that you should be free to make a proper choice now." Graham's hands clenched around his coffee cup. Reverend Morrison was the fire and brimstone preacher who'd replaced Josie's father, a man more concerned with moral purity than human compassion. "He has no right to interfere in our marriage," Graham said tightly. "Legally, no," Doc Henderson agreed. "But he's stirring up enough sentiment that Sheriff Cole thought you should be warned. There's talk of a formal challenge to the marriage's validity." Josie felt the fragile security she'd built crumbling around her. Just when she'd found the courage to embrace her choices, external forces were threatening to tear apart everything she'd fought to protect. "Could they really annul our marriage?" she asked. "It's possible," Doc Henderson admitted reluctantly. "If they could prove coercion or fraud, if they could demonstrate that the marriage wasn't consummated, or that it was entered into under false pretenses." "It wasn't false pretenses," Graham said firmly. "We were honest about what we were offering each other, but you weren't honest about knowing her father," Doc Henderson pointed out gently. "And now there's this inheritance that suggests the marriage was unnecessary from a financial standpoint. A skilled lawyer could construct an argument." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Everything they'd built, everything they'd come to cherish, could be swept away by legal technicalities and moral grandstanding. "What would we need to do to protect ourselves?" Josie asked finally. Doc Henderson looked uncomfortable. "You'd need to demonstrate that this is a real marriage in every sense, that you chose each other freely, that you're committed to a life together, that the relationship is genuine and complete." The euphemistic language couldn't hide the reality of what he was suggesting. To protect their marriage, they would need to make it real in ways they'd carefully avoided. They would need to move beyond the safe boundaries of companionship and partnership into the more dangerous territory of true intimacy. After Doc Henderson left, Graham and Josie found themselves alone in the kitchen, the weight of his words hanging. Between them, like a challenge, neither was sure they were ready to meet. "We could fight it in court," Graham said finally. "Hire lawyers, challenge their right to interfere, and put our private business on display for the whole territory to judge." Josie shook her head. "Even if we won, the scandal would follow. Us forever. It would follow Tommy. Then what do you suggest?" Josie was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I suggest we decide what we really want, and then we fight for it. No more half measures, no more careful. Boundaries. If we're going to be married, let's be truly married. If we're going to be a family, let's be a real family." Graham's grey eyes searched her face. "Are you sure? Once we cross that line, there's no going back to the safe arrangement we had." "I don't want to go back," Josie said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. I want to go forward. The question is whether you want that too. Before Graham could answer, Tommy burst through the kitchen door, his face flushed with excitement from his morning adventures. The serious conversation was temporarily shelved as they attended to the immediate needs of a hungry 7-year-old, but the questions lingered in the air between them. That evening, after Tommy had been put to bed, Graham found Josie on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl against the cool night air. She was holding the train ticket her brother had given her, not to leave, but as a reminder of choices she'd decided not to make. I keep thinking about roads not taken, she said as he settled beside her, about the life I might have had if I'd known about the inheritance from the beginning. Regrets? No, just wonder. I think I would have been safe with that money, but I don't think I would have been happy. Safety isn't the same as living. Graham nodded, understanding the distinction in a way he couldn't have before she'd entered his life. His years of isolation had been safe, but they hadn't been alive. Josie, about what Doc Henderson said, No, it's a lot to ask, she interrupted, to risk your heart again when you've already lost so much. But I need you to know that if we do this, if we make this marriage real in every way, it won't be because of external pressure or legal necessity. It will be because I love you. The words hung in the night air, simple and honest and terrifying in their implications. Graham felt something tight in his chest loosen. A breath he'd been holding for 3 years finally released. I love you too, he said quietly. I think I've been falling in love with you since that first night when you read to Tommy by lamplight. I was just too scared to admit it. So where does that leave us? Graham took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. It leaves us with a choice. We can let other people dictate what our marriage should be, or we can decide for ourselves. We can let fear keep us apart, or we can trust that what we've found is worth protecting. And Tommy wants a real family as much as we do, maybe more. Josie leaned against Graham's shoulder, feeling for the first time in months that the future was truly hers to shape. Then let's give him one. Let's give ourselves one. Inside the house, the mantel clock chimed 10 o'clock, marking the end of one day and the beginning of what they both hoped would be a new chapter in their carefully constructed life. Tomorrow, they would begin the delicate process of transforming a marriage of convenience into something deeper and more enduring. Tonight, they simply sat together under the vast Wyoming sky, holding hands and holding hope, ready to fight for the love they'd been afraid to claim. The train ticket fluttered in the evening breeze, a symbol of roads not taken, choices not made, and a future that would be built not on running away, but on running toward each other with courage and faith, and the kind of love that could weather any storm the world might send their way. The morning after their conversation on the porch dawned clear and bright, as if the world itself was celebrating the decision they'd made to stop hiding from their feelings. Josie woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years, not the desperate drive for survival that had sustained her through the darkest times, but the quiet determination of someone who'd finally found what was worth fighting for. Graham was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs, but something was different about his manner. The careful distance he'd maintained since learning about the inheritance had been replaced by a warmth that reminded her of their early days at the ranch, before complications and revelations had clouded their relationship. "Good morning, Mrs. Sinclair," he said, and the way he spoke her married name made her heart flutter with possibilities. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, allowing herself to smile with an openness she'd been afraid to show. "Sleep well? Better than I have in weeks," he admitted. "There's something to be said for honesty." Tommy bounded into the kitchen, with his usual morning enthusiasm, immediately launching into plans for the day that involved teaching the new calf to follow him around the barnyard. His easy chatter filled the space between his parents, but Josie noticed how Graham's attention kept returning to her, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. After breakfast, As they'd done countless mornings before, Graham prepared to head out for the day's ranch work. But instead of the perfunctory goodbye that had become their routine, he paused at the door. "Josie," he said, his voice carrying a note of formality that made her look up from the dishes she was washing. "Would you take a walk with me this evening? After Tommy's asleep, there are things we should discuss." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. This would be the conversation that would determine the shape of their future, not the practical arrangements they'd made months ago, but the real choices that would define what kind of life they built together. "I'd like that," she said softly. They passed with an undercurrent of anticipation that neither quite knew how to navigate. They moved through their usual routines, Josie tending the house and garden, Graham working with the cattle and horses, Tommy dividing his time between both parents with the unconscious ease of a child who felt secure in his world. But beneath the familiar rhythms, something was shifting, preparing for transformation. That afternoon brought an unexpected test of their newfound resolve. Reverend Morrison arrived at the ranch in his black buggy, his stern face set in lines of righteous determination. Josie watched from the kitchen window as he climbed down from his seat with the deliberate movements of a man on a mission. Graham met him at the front porch, his posture immediately defensive. The conversation was too distant for Josie to hear. The words, but the tension in both men's stances was clear. After several minutes, Graham gestured toward the house, and both men disappeared from her view as they climbed the porch steps. "Mrs. Sinclair," Reverend Morrison said as he entered the front parlor, his cold eyes taking in the comfortable domesticity of the room. "I trust you're well." "Very well, thank you," Josie replied, maintaining her composure despite the man's obvious disapproval. "I've come to discuss a matter of some concern to the moral welfare of this community," Morrison continued, settling into a chair without being invited. "Specifically, the circumstances of your marriage to Mr. Sinclair." Graham remained standing, his presence filling the room with protective energy. "I thought I made it clear in town that our marriage is not open for public discussion. All marriages are subject to God's judgment, Mr. Sinclair, and when a union is entered into for purposes other than holy love and commitment, it becomes a matter for spiritual intervention." Josie felt her temper rise at the man's presumptuous tone, but she kept her voice level. "Reverend Morrison, I'm curious about your definition of holy love. Does it require passion over partnership? Drama over devotion? Because I can assure you that my marriage is built on genuine care, mutual respect, and shared commitment to our family." "But was it built on love?" Morrison pressed. "Or was it a business arrangement disguised as a sacred bond? Does it matter how it began if it's become something real?" Graham asked, echoing the question that had plagued them both. "It matters to God," Morrison replied sternly, "and it matters to the law. A marriage entered into under false pretenses, without genuine commitment or conjugal relations, is not a marriage at all." The invasive nature of his inquiry made Josie's cheeks burn with indignation. "Reverend Morrison, the intimate details of our marriage are not your concern. They become my concern when members of my congregation question whether this union represents moral behavior or elaborate deception." Morrison leaned forward, his eyes glinting with the fervor of someone convinced of his own righteousness. "Mrs. Sinclair, you have substantial means now. You could live independently, respectably. Why continue this charade?" "Because it's not a charade," Josie said firmly, rising from her chair. "This is my home, Graham is my husband, and Tommy has found a father who loves him. We are a family in every way that matters." Morrison's gaze shifted between them, calculating. "In every way? Then you'll have no objection to making a formal declaration before the church that this marriage has been consummated and that you intend to honor your vows in full." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Josie felt her face flame with embarrassment at the public nature of what he was demanding, but she also recognized the trap he was setting. To refuse would suggest they had something to hide. To agree would require them to make public claims about the private nature of their relationship. "We have nothing to prove to you or anyone else," Graham said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Then, prove it," Morrison countered. "Renew your vows before the congregation. Make a public declaration of your commitment. Let the community witness your genuine devotion to each other." Josie and Graham exchanged glances, both understanding the implications of what was being proposed. A public ceremony would require them to declare their love openly, to make promises they weren't sure they were ready to make, and to face the scrutiny of a community that had already judged them. "Give us time to consider," Graham said finally. "I'll give you 1 week," Morrison replied, rising from his chair. "After that, I'll be forced to take the matter to higher church authorities and possibly to territorial court. Good day." After he left, Josie and Graham stood in the suddenly quiet parlor, the weight of his ultimatum settling around them like a heavy blanket. 1 week, Josie said softly. 1 week to decide if we're brave enough to make our marriage real in front of the whole town, Graham agreed. "Are we?" Graham moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his grey eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I know what I want, Josie. The question is whether you're ready to want it too." She looked up at him, this man who'd given her shelter and safety, and something that felt dangerously close to love. "I'm tired of being careful, Graham. I'm tired of protecting myself from possibilities. If we're going to do this, let's do it completely, even knowing it might change everything between us. Especially knowing that." She reached up and touched his face, her fingertips tracing the line of his jaw. "Some changes are worth the risk." That evening, after Tommy had been put to bed with extra stories and gentle reassurances about the stern visitor's presence, Graham and Josie finally took their promised walk. They followed the path that led from the house to the small rise overlooking the valley. The same route Tommy often took when he wanted to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The silence between them was comfortable, now no longer weighted with unspoken tensions, but filled with the anticipation of new beginnings. When they reached the top of the rise, Graham spread his coat on the ground, and they sat together, looking out over the land that had become home to them all. "I've been thinking about what Morrison said," Josie began, her voice thoughtful in the gathering dusk. "About proving our marriage is real, and I realized something." "What's that?" "We've been proving it every day, just not in the ways he recognizes. We've proven it in the way you read to Tommy every night, and the way I mend your shirts because I care about your comfort. We've proven it in shared meals and quiet conversations, and the way we've learned to work together as partners." Graham nodded, understanding her meaning. "But he wants a different kind of proof. He wants passion, drama, the kind of love that burns bright and fast." Josie turned to face him more fully. "But maybe what we have is better. Maybe love that grows slowly, built on respect and trust and genuine liking. Maybe that's stronger than the alternative. Is that what you think we have, love?" The question was asked quietly, but Josie heard the vulnerability beneath the words. This strong, self-contained man was asking her to be brave enough to name what was growing between them. "Yes," she said simply, "I think we have love. Not the desperate, overwhelming kind that swept me away when I was 18, but something deeper, something that feels like coming home." Graham was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Sarah was my first love, the kind that feels like lightning strikes. It was beautiful and intense, and it nearly destroyed me when I lost it." He turned to meet Josie's eyes. "What I feel for you is different, calmer, but somehow more solid, like finding something I didn't know I was looking for. So what do we do about Reverend Morrison's ultimatum?" "We call his bluff," Graham said with growing conviction. "We renew our vows publicly, and we mean every word. We tell the whole town that this marriage is real, that this family is real, and that anyone who wants to challenge that can answer to us." Josie felt something settle in her chest, a peace she hadn't experienced since childhood. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Graham reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips for a gentle kiss. "The only thing I'm not sure about is whether you're ready to be Mrs. Graham Sinclair in every sense of the word." The invitation was clear, as was the choice she needed to make. They could continue their careful partnership, maintaining the safe distance that had protected them both from deeper hurt. Or they could take the leap into something more complete, more vulnerable, and infinitely more meaningful. "I'm ready," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As if her words had broken some invisible barrier between them, Graham leaned closer, his hand coming up to cup her face with infinite gentleness. When their lips met, it wasn't with the desperate passion of young love, but with the considered tenderness of two people who'd found their way to each other through hardship and hope. The kiss was everything their relationship had been: patient, honest, and full of promise for the future they would build together. When they finally drew apart, Josie rested her forehead against Graham's, both of them breathing hard with the wonder of what they'd finally allowed themselves to feel. "So, we're really doing this?" she asked softly. "We're really doing this," Graham confirmed. "1 week from today, we're going to stand in front of the whole town and promise to love each other for the rest of our lives. And this time, we're going to mean every word." Below them, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled in the growing darkness, a community that would soon witness the transformation of a marriage of convenience into something much more precious, a true union of hearts that had found their way home to each other. The week that followed their decision passed in a blur of quiet preparation and growing anticipation. Word of the planned ceremony spread through Cedar Ridge with the efficiency of small-town gossip, sparking conversations in every parlor and storefront about the unusual couple who'd challenged everyone's assumptions about love and marriage. Josie found herself the recipient of unexpected kindnesses as the day approached. Mrs. Henderson arrived with fabric for a new dress. "Every bride deserves something special," she insisted, despite Josie's protests that this wasn't really a wedding. Doc Henderson's wife had enlisted several other ladies to help with the sewing, and their fingers flew through delicate work that transformed simple blue cotton into something worthy of the occasion. "You've brought him back to life, you know," Mrs. Patterson confided as she worked tiny pearl buttons down the dress's front. "Graham Sinclair was disappearing bit by bit after Sarah died. Watching him with you and that boy, it's like seeing someone remember how to breathe again." The support surprised Josie, who'd grown accustomed to being the subject of whispered criticism rather than approval. But perhaps her marriage to Graham had given the community permission to acknowledge what many had quietly observed, that their unconventional family worked in ways that traditional arrangements sometimes didn't. Graham, meanwhile, was dealing with his own preparations and revelations. Sheriff Cole had stopped by the ranch with information that both troubled and relieved him. "Those debt collectors who were sniffing around," Cole said as they stood in the barn, ostensibly inspecting a horse's injured hoof. "Turns out they had no legal claim to pursue Robert Lang's debts. The gambling occurred in a jurisdiction where such debts aren't inheritable by widows. They were running a confidence game, hoping to pressure desperate women into paying money. They didn't actually owe." Graham's jaw tightened. "So Josie was never in real danger from them?" "Not legal danger, no. Though men like that don't always limit themselves to legal means of collection." Cole's expression was grim. "Point is, your marriage protected her from more than you knew. Whether or not that was the original intention, the knowledge that their union had served its protective purpose even more completely than they'd realized gave Graham a sense of satisfaction, but it also underscored how much their relationship had evolved beyond its practical origins. Tommy, sensing the significance of the approaching ceremony, even if he didn't fully understand its implications, threw himself into preparations with characteristic enthusiasm. He practiced walking solemnly down the church aisle, appointed himself official flower arranger for the house, and pestered both adults with questions about whether this meant they'd be more married than before. "Will you kiss Mama in church?" he asked Graham one evening as they groomed the horses together. "I expect I will," Graham replied, hiding a smile at the boy's serious tone. "Good. Billy Peterson says married people should kiss so everyone knows they like each other. I think everyone should know you like Mama." The simple wisdom of childhood often cut straight to the heart of complex adult emotions. Graham realized that Tommy was right. It was time for the whole world to know how he felt about Josie Lang Sinclair. The night before the ceremony, Josie stood in her bedroom looking at the new dress hanging from the wardrobe door. It was beautiful in its simplicity. The blue fabric brought out her eyes, and the careful tailoring flattered her figure without being ostentatious. More importantly, it represented something she'd never had before. A community of women who'd worked together to honor her happiness. A soft knock on her door interrupted her contemplation. "Come in." Graham entered, carrying something wrapped in soft cloth. His expression was serious but not troubled, the look of a man who'd made peace with a difficult decision. "I have something for you," he said, setting the bundle on her dressing table. "Something that belongs in this family now." Josie unwrapped the cloth to reveal Sarah's china tea set, the delicate cups and saucers she'd discovered months ago in the pantry. But now the pieces weren't hidden away like secret treasures. They gleamed with fresh cleaning, ready to be used and enjoyed. "Graham, I can't." "Yes, you can," he said gently. Sarah would have wanted them to be part of a living home, not preserved. Like museum pieces, she'd have wanted them to serve tea to friends, to be used for special occasions, to be part of the daily life of people who care about each other. Josie lifted one of the cups, admiring its rose pattern in the lamplight. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure about a lot of things now." Graham moved closer, his hands coming to rest lightly on her shoulders. "I'm sure that what we have is real. I'm sure that Tommy is the son of my heart, even if not my blood. And I'm sure that tomorrow I want to promise the whole world that you're my wife, my partner, and my choice for whatever years God gives us." The sincerity in his voice made Josie's throat tight with emotion. "And after tomorrow, what happens when we're truly married in every sense? After tomorrow, we build the life we've been afraid to want. We have more children if God blesses us. We watch Tommy grow into the fine man he's already becoming. We grow old together on this ranch, surrounded by family and community and all the ordinary miracles that make up a well-lived life." It was a beautiful vision, simple in its scope but profound in its implications. Josie had spent so many years just surviving that the possibility of truly thriving felt almost foreign. But standing in her bedroom, holding Sarah's teacup while Graham painted pictures of their future, she could finally believe in happiness. "I love you," she said, the words coming easier each time she spoke them. "I love the man you are, the father you've become to Tommy, the partner you've been to me. Tomorrow isn't about proving anything to Reverend Morrison or the town. It's about celebrating what we've found together." Graham's hands tightened on her shoulders. "And tonight?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility and choice. They'd been careful with each other for so long, maintaining boundaries that had protected them from disappointment, but also from deeper connection. Tonight could be the beginning of something new, or it could be a continuation of the careful friendship they'd built. Josie set down the teacup and turned to face him fully. "Tonight, we stop being careful. Tonight, we stop protecting ourselves from what we might lose and start embracing what we've found." The permission in her words unlocked something in Graham that he'd kept carefully controlled since Sarah's death. He pulled Josie into his arms, holding her close enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair and the essential sweetness that was uniquely hers. "Are you certain?" he whispered against her ear. "I've never been more certain of anything. What followed was tender and unhurried, the natural culmination of months of growing trust and deepening affection. They came together not with desperate passion, but with the considered intimacy of two people who'd learned to value what they'd found in each other. It was healing for both of them, Graham's first step beyond the grief that had consumed him, and Josie's discovery that physical love could be about partnership rather than need. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the lamplight, Josie traced patterns on Graham's chest and marveled at how right this felt. Not overwhelming or desperate, but peaceful and complete. No regrets? Graham asked softly. Only that we waited so long, Josie replied, then laughed at her own honesty. Though maybe we needed to wait. Maybe we needed to build everything else. First, the trust, the friendship, the partnership. Maybe the love is stronger because it grew from something solid. Graham pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Tomorrow, the whole town will know we're really married. Tonight we know we're really in love. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, as if the weather itself was celebrating their decision to claim their happiness publicly. The little church was fuller than it had been for a regular service in months, with townspeople who'd come to witness what many privately hoped would be a triumph of practical love over rigid morality. Josie walked down the aisle in her new blue dress, her hand resting on Tommy's small arm as he solemnly escorted her to where Graham waited. The boy wore his best clothes and a serious expression that suggested he understood the importance of the moment, even if its complexities were beyond his years. Graham stood at the altar wearing his finest suit, but it was his expression that took Josie's breath away. Gone was the careful reserve he'd maintained for so long. Instead, his face was open and unguarded, showing the whole congregation exactly how he felt about the woman walking toward him. Reverend Morrison performed the bay ceremony with grudging correctness, unable to find fault with vows that were clearly heartfelt and freely given. When Graham and Josie promised to love, honor, and cherish each other for as long as they both lived, their voices carried conviction that rang through the small church. But it was the kiss that sealed their victory over skepticism and doubt. When Graham took Josie in his arms and kissed her with gentle passion, there wasn't a person in the congregation who could doubt the genuineness of their love. This wasn't a performance or a business arrangement. This was a man and woman who'd found their way to each other and weren't afraid to let the world see what they'd discovered. Tommy clapped enthusiastically, his joy infectious enough to spread. Smiles throughout the assembled crowd. Even some of the more stern-faced attendees found themselves warming to the obvious happiness of this unconventional family. The reception that followed was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the front, yard and food provided by neighbors who'd come to accept Josie as one of their own. As the afternoon wore on, even the most stubborn skeptics found it hard to argue with the evidence before their eyes. A family that worked, a love that was real, and a happiness that had been earned through trial and choice rather than simply stumbled upon. As evening approached and the guests began to depart, Graham and Josie stood on their front porch with Tommy between them, watching the last wagons disappear down the road toward town. The boy was tired but exhilarated, chattering about all the food he'd eaten and the compliments he'd received on his role in the ceremony. "Are we really truly married now?" Tommy asked, looking up at both adults with satisfaction. "Really, truly," Josie confirmed, ruffling his hair. "Good," Tommy said with the finality of someone whose world had just become perfectly ordered. "Now, we're a real family." As they put Tommy to bed that night, both Graham and Josie felt the truth of his words. They were indeed a real family now. Not because a preacher had declared them so, but because they'd chosen each other completely and without reservation. The careful boundaries and protective distances of their early months together had been replaced by the open honesty of people who'd found their home in each other. Later, as they sat together on the front porch in the gathering dusk, Josie leaned against Graham's shoulder and marveled at how much their lives had changed since that desperate day at the mercantile. "Do you think my father would have approved?" she asked, thinking of the letter that had helped her understand so much about the past. "I think your father would have been proud," Graham replied. "Not just of the choice you made, but of the courage it took to choose love over safety, partnership over independence." Above them, the first stars were appearing in the vast Wyoming sky, the same stars that had witnessed their tentative beginning and would now watch over their certain future. Tomorrow would bring the ordinary challenges of ranch life, the daily choices that would continue to build their love, and the gradual accumulation of shared experiences that would weave their lives together into something unbreakable. But tonight, they simply held each other under the starlight, grateful for the unexpected grace that had brought them together and the courage they'd found to claim the happiness they deserved. 1 year later, the Sinclair Ranch bloomed with the kind of contentment that only comes from lives lived with purpose and love. Autumn had painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, and the harvest had been the most abundant in Graham's memory, a fitting metaphor for the richness that had entered their lives in ways they'd never dared to hope. Josie stood in the kitchen, one hand resting on her gently rounded belly, while the other stirred a pot of stew that would feed not just her immediate family, but the 3 ranch hands Graham had hired to help with the expanded operation. The inheritance money had been wisely invested, part of it in improving the ranch, part set aside for Tommy's education, and a portion donated to establish a fund for widows and orphans in Cedar Ridge. Her father's money had become a source of blessing rather than burden, supporting not just their family, but their community. Through the window, she could see Tommy, now 8 and sturdy as a young oak, helping Graham repair a section of fence that the recent storms had damaged. The boy had grown tall over the past year, but more importantly, he'd grown confident. His laughter echoed across the yard as Graham showed him how to twist wire properly, their heads bent together in the easy communion of father and son. The sound of an approaching wagon drew Josie's attention, and she smiled as she recognized Doc Henderson's familiar figure driving up the path. These days, his visits were more social than medical, though he'd been keeping a careful eye on her pregnancy, the baby that would arrive in spring, a living symbol of the love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings. "Afternoon, Josie," Doc Henderson called as he climbed down from his seat. "How are you feeling?" "Wonderful," she replied honestly, stepping onto the porch to greet him. "A little tired, but Tommy was much harder to carry. I suppose experience makes everything easier. Or maybe contentment makes the body more willing to nurture new life," Doc Henderson suggested, with the gentle wisdom that had made him beloved throughout the territory. "You look like a woman at peace with herself." It was true. The anxious wariness that had defined Josie's demeanor for so many years had been replaced by a serenity that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The woman who had once stolen bread to feed her child now served on the church committee and had become one of the most respected members of Cedar Ridge society, not because of her husband's wealth, but because of her own grace and wisdom. "Graham, and tells me you've been corresponding with your brother," Doc Henderson continued as they settled into chairs on the front porch. "Marcus writes every month," Josie confirmed. "He's thinking of moving back to Wyoming territory. Says Denver is too fast-paced for a man who's discovered the value of family connections." The reconciliation with her brother had been one of the unexpected gifts of the past year. Marcus Lang Jr. had become a regular visitor to the ranch, delighting in his role as uncle to Tommy and eagerly anticipating the arrival of another niece or nephew. His legal expertise had been invaluable in establishing the charitable fund, and his presence had helped heal wounds Josie hadn't realized she was still carrying. Graham and Tommy approached the house as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, their work completed and their boots dusty from honest labor. Tommy ran ahead to greet Doc Henderson with the enthusiasm he showed all his favorite people, while Graham's eyes immediately sought Josie's, the small smile that passed between them speaking of the intimate understanding that had only deepened. With time, "Doc," Graham said, settling onto the porch rail. "Good to see you. What brings you out our way?" "Partly medical business," Doc Henderson replied, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "I wanted to tell Josie that her examination last week confirms what we suspected. The baby is healthy and developing perfectly. But mostly I came because I have news I thought you'd want to hear." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a letter bearing official seals. "This came through the territorial capital. Reverend Morrison has been transferred to a parish in Montana. Seems his superiors felt his zealous approach was better suited to a frontier community that needed firm moral guidance." Graham and Josie exchanged glances, both remembering the man whose interference had ultimately forced them to acknowledge their true feelings. In an odd way, they owed him a debt of gratitude. "Who's replacing him?" Josie asked. "Young fellow named David Fletcher, fresh from seminary, but with modern ideas about pastoral care. Preaches more about love and less about judgment from what I hear." That evening, as had become their cherished routine, the family gathered in the front parlor after supper. Tommy sat at the small desk Graham had built for him, working on his arithmetic under the warm glow of the oil lamp. His schoolwork had improved dramatically since gaining the security of a stable home and the encouragement of two parents who valued education. Josie settled into her favorite chair with her mending, while Graham read from the territorial newspaper, occasionally sharing items of interest. It was a scene of such ordinary domestic happiness that visitors often remarked on the palpable contentment that filled the house. "Mama," Tommy said, looking up from his sums, "will the new baby like horses as much as I do?" "I don't know," Josie replied with a smile. "Different people like different things, but I'm sure Papa Graham will teach the baby about horses, just like he taught you." "And I'll help," Tommy declared, with the seriousness of someone accepting an important responsibility. "I'll be the best big brother ever." Graham lowered his newspaper to look at the boy who'd become so precious to him. "You already are the best son a man could ask for, Tommy. I have no doubt you'll be just as good a brother." The simple exchange exemplified what their family had become, a place where love was expressed freely, where each member felt valued and secure, and where the future was approached with hope rather than fear. Later, after Tommy had been tucked into bed with his customary stories and prayers, Graham and Josie sat together on the front porch, wrapped in a shared quilt against the cool autumn air. These quiet moments had become sacred to them, time to reconnect after the day's responsibilities and to simply enjoy each other's presence. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Josie asked, her hand resting on her. "Growing belly where their child stirred gently, different how? If you hadn't stepped forward that day at the mercantile, if I'd found some other way to survive, if we'd never found each other." Graham considered the question seriously. "I think we would have survived, both of us. You're too strong to be broken by hardship, and I'm too stubborn to give up completely. But surviving isn't the same as living, is it?" "No," Josie agreed softly. "Before I came here, I was just getting through each day. Now I wake up looking forward to what the day will bring, even the difficult days, especially the difficult days. When you face challenges with someone you love, with a partner who shares the load, even the hardest times become bearable." Graham pulled her closer, marveling as he often did at the completeness he felt when she was in his arms. "I spent 3 years thinking my chance for happiness had died with Sarah. I never imagined I could love differently, but just as deeply. Are they very different? Your feelings for Sarah and your feelings for me?" It was a question Josie had never asked directly, though Graham knew she'd wondered about it. He took time to consider his answer, wanting to be completely honest. "Sarah was my first love, intense and overwhelming. Loving her felt like being caught in a storm, beautiful but sometimes frightening in its power. Loving you feels like coming, a home after a long journey, different but not less, maybe more sustainable." Josie understood. Her own love for Robert had been the passionate attachment of youth, while her love for Graham was the deeper affection of maturity. built on knowledge rather than hope, tested by experience rather than shielded from it. I'm grateful for both, she said. For the love that taught me what was possible, and for the love that taught me what was lasting. Above them, a shooting star traced its brief path across the sky, and they both made silent wishes, not for dramatic changes or miraculous interventions, but for the continuation of the quiet blessings they'd learned to recognize and cherish. The months that followed passed with the gentle rhythm of lives well lived. Winter brought cozy evenings by the fire, with Tommy learning to read more advanced books and helping Josie prepare for the baby's arrival. Spring came early, painting the valley in soft greens and bringing with it the birth of their daughter, a healthy, red-faced little girl they named Grace after the baby Josie had lost, and the concept that had brought them all together. Tommy proved to be a devoted big brother, helping with feeding and taking seriously his role as protector of the tiny person who'd joined their family. Graham, who'd once thought fatherhood was lost to him forever, discovered the profound joy of holding his own child, the daughter who carried both his and Josie's features and who represented the future they'd built together. As summer arrived and Grace grew into a smiling, alert baby who delighted in her family's attention, visitors to the ranch often remarked on the obvious happiness that filled the Sinclair home. The marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement had become a model for the kind of partnership that sustained both individuals and community. On the first anniversary of their renewal ceremony, the family gathered in the small cemetery, where both Sarah Sinclair and Marcus Lang Sr. rested. They placed wildflowers on both graves, an acknowledgement of the past that had shaped them, and gratitude for the love that had emerged from loss. "Thank you," Graham said quietly to Sarah's headstone, his arm around Josie's waist while she held baby Grace, and Tommy stood solemnly beside them. "For teaching me how to love, and for somehow making it possible for me to love again." Josie, standing at her father's grave, whispered her own prayer of forgiveness and gratitude. "You were right about some things, Papa. Grace does come in unexpected packages, and love, real love, is worth waiting for." As they walked back to the house, Tommy skipping ahead while Grace cooed contentedly in her mother's arms, Graham and Josie reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. "No regrets?" Graham asked, echoing a question he'd posed many times over the past 2 years. "Only that it took us so long to trust what we were building," Josie replied. "But maybe that was necessary too. Maybe we had to be sure it was real before we could fully embrace it." That evening, as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple, baby Grace, sleeping peacefully in Josie's arms while Tommy dozed against Graham's shoulder, they spoke of the future with the confidence of people who'd learned that love, carefully tended, could weather any storm. Their story had begun with desperation and unexpected kindness, but it had become something far more precious, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most lasting happiness comes not from dramatic passion, but from the quiet courage to choose love. Day after day, in all its ordinary and extraordinary manifestations. Years later, when Tommy was grown and had children of his own, when Grace had become a young woman of remarkable character, when Graham's hair had turned silver and Josie's face had acquired the lines that come from a lifetime of laughter, visitors to the ranch would still comment on the obvious contentment that radiated from the family who lived there. They'd built more than a marriage. They'd created a legacy of love that would echo through generations, proving that sometimes the most beautiful stories are those that begin not with love at first sight, but with the patient decision to love at last sight. When two people finally see each other clearly and choose to build a life together on the solid foundation of mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of affection that deepens with time rather than fading with familiarity. In the end, the woman who'd once stolen bread to feed her child had given her family something far more nourishing, the security that comes from being truly known and loved, and the example of what's possible when people have the courage to claim the happiness they deserve.